morning they found Caleb Redmarsh dead in his own bed, the frost hadn't yet lifted from the prairie grass. The sun pressed pale against a hard sky, and the wind carried the brittle scent of burnt cedar and cow dung. Atop a ridge 2 miles from the Redmarsh spread the accused. Etta Lowe was already walking, headed nowhere with a bruised mouth and a stitched satchel swinging from her shoulder. She didn't stop when she heard the rider behind her, didn't flinch when they called her name. She was dragged back to town with her arms bound and her lips split wider, though she didn't cry out once. Sheriff Doran said she'd been the last person to bring Caleb his coffee the night before, that she'd had the kitchen to herself, and that her silence all but admitted guilt. There was belladonna in the coffee grounds, and Caleb's mouth had foamed dry as a horned toad's before he went stiff in his sheets. That was all the law cared to know. Etta didn't testify. She sat on the edge of the courtroom bench with a slack jaw and dark hair unwashed, her eyes fixed somewhere above the judge's head. Her silence was as damning as the evidence. Caleb's son, Joshua, watched her from across the room with a face carved of ashwood. He hadn't cried when they told him his father was dead, hadn't spoken to Etta since the hanging was set. They gave her 6 days in the jailhouse before the rope. The townsfolk didn't say out loud, but whispered in parlors and behind barn doors, was that Caleb had taken Etta in from the reservation like a man might take in a stray mule, fed her, housed her, taught her chores. But there were bruises on her once and cuts that didn't look accidental. She was 17 when he brought her down off the ridge, already hardened from a life in scrubland silence. Some said she was too proud to thank him. Others said she never owed him thanks in the first place. The night of the killing, thunder shook the floorboards. The livestock bucked their pens, and the dogs barked into the storm like something old and evil had slunk down from the hills. Caleb's widow, Josie, said Etta had been outside during the worst of it, barefoot and murmuring strange words under her breath. Said the girl came back inside dripping, her eyes glassy, and made tea without saying a thing. No one asked why Caleb had been sleeping in the guest house alone, or why his own son hadn't visited him in over a week. No one asked why Josie, pale and jumpy, always kept her door bolted at night. In jail, Etta refused the preacher's prayers. She took her meals in silence and folded the blankets too neatly. Sheriff Doran called her ungrateful. The deputy spit in her cell once, and she didn't blink. But on the 5th day, just as the gallows beam was being tested out behind the livery, Joshua came. He hadn't spoken in court, hadn't spoken to anyone much since his father's death. But now he stood in the cold light of the jailhouse and stared at the girl who'd served under his roof, who'd mucked stalls and cooked stew, and never once looked him in the eye unless it was to speak plain. "You didn't poison him," Joshua said. Etta didn't answer. "I saw the ledger," he continued. "The shipments, the payments, something's off." The sheriff stirred behind him, clicking his tongue. "You best get going, boy. The law's been settled." Joshua didn't move. What if the law's wrong? "Then the Lord will correct it," Doran replied. The next day, Joshua left town. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, but he took his father's old satchel and the rifle his grandfather had carried in the Indian Wars. He rode east, following the trade lines, hunting the names in the ledger and asking questions where no one liked being asked. Behind him, the townsfolk prepared for the hanging. Etta watched the wind move outside the bars, as if something out there waited for her, not with mercy, but with purpose. The same purpose that had kept her alive when others from her camp had starved, the same purpose that had steeled her to silence, to pain, to the cold mathematics of survival. She knew what it meant to be judged without words, but she also knew the look in Joshua's eyes. He was too much like his mother. Josie Redmarsh never wept, not when her husband was buried, not when the crowd had quieted down after the verdict. But when she visited Etta in jail, alone, without a lantern, she knelt in front of the bars and spoke with a breathless whisper. "I know what he did to you." Etta said nothing. "I wanted him dead, not like that, not by poison, but dead just the same." Etta tilted her head slightly. Josie's hands trembled as she passed a slip of paper through the bars. "I thought you might be my punishment," she whispered, "but maybe you're my chance." By morning, Josie was gone. She left the ranch without word, packed a bag, and disappeared downriver. The sheriff said it was cowardice. Others thought it was grief. But Etta, folding the paper in her lap, read the names written in Josie's tight, careful hand, names that matched the ones in Caleb's ledger, names linked to more than cattle, more than supplies. Names that breathed smoke and gold. Joshua was already riding to find them. And now Etta, 4 days from death, had something like a map. The townsfolk said the girl was silent as stone. But something in her had begun to move. Joshua reached Bitter Creek by dusk on the 7th day. A mining town scarred by tin roofs and rust, its streets thick with coal smoke and suspicion. He hadn't shaved since leaving home. Dust crusted the hem of his coat, but he walked with purpose through the saloon doors and dropped Caleb Redmarsh's ledger on the bar like it was a law book. The bartender blinked twice, then reached for the whiskey shelf. Joshua didn't drink, not then. He'd been following a name, Harlan Duque, a supplier who once moved cattle feed and liquor barrels up through the Redmarsh line, though his invoices were full of strange discrepancies. Extra weight, shadow goods, unregistered wagons. He found Duque in the back of a warehouse with a swollen gut and a shotgun across his lap. The man laughed when he saw Joshua. "You his boy?" he asked. "Caleb, guess you be looking for a reckoning." Joshua didn't flinch. "I'm looking for truth." Duque snorted, leaned forward, and spat into a rusted bucket. "Truth's a weak man's coin, but I'll give you a trade. You leave now, and I don't put your teeth on the wall." Joshua didn't leave. The fight was short and bloody. Joshua took the stock of the shotgun to the ribs, but Duque ended up in the dirt with his nose cracked wide open and a knife at his throat. That's when he talked. Not to save his own life, but because men like him always liked the sound of their own schemes. "Your daddy weren't just moving cattle," he said, grinning red through his teeth. "He was moving girls." The knife bit deeper. From the northern camps, Duque wheezed. Young, quiet, didn't matter if they came willin', he had a contract. They went east to the mines. Caleb got paid twice, once by their people, once by the brothels. Joshua's hand shook. "And that little wild-eyed one, the one in your jail right now, she saw more than she oughta. Maybe she was next, maybe she was, but Caleb never liked trouble, so he kept her where he could watch." Joshua didn't kill Duque, he should have. Instead, he tied him to a post and set fire to the shack. Let the town come out and stare. Let them see what sort of man the Redmarsh name had been dealing with. By the time he rode west again, he had more names. More rot traced through the ledger's ink like blood veins. And with each mile, something burned quieter and deeper in him, something that looked less like justice and more like vengeance wearing its skin. Meanwhile, back in Sparrow Falls, the noose had been strung. Etta hadn't spoken since Josie's visit, but the paper in her boot, crisp with names and inked in a widow's trembling hand, had been memorized, burned behind her eyes like a scripture. She knew who they were now, the men who had come through the ranch on quiet nights with their teeth too clean and voices too smooth. The ones who never looked her in the eye. The ones who smiled when Caleb gripped her wrist a little too tight. Sheriff Doran came to her cell that morning with a smirk on his face. "Hope you've made peace with your maker." Etta looked at him, her gaze flat and ancient. "He doesn't speak to people like me." She walked to the gallows without a shiver. The sky had gone a dry kind of blue, the kind that felt scraped thin by wind and silence. The townsfolk gathered close, not for justice, but for the kind of spectacle that made their own sins feel smaller. Etta stood beneath the beam. The hood was drawn back. The rope hung just above her shoulder like a question mark. And then from the north came hoofbeats. Fast, hard, a dust trail kicked up behind a sorrel mare, and the figure on its back rode like the devil was at his heels. Joshua tore into town, rifle slung, coat open, a paper clutched in one hand. He didn't stop at the gallows. He didn't even shout until he'd reached the steps. "She's innocent," he said, voice raw. "I have proof." The rope didn't fall. Not yet. Sheriff Doran held up a hand and squinted. "You best be right, boy. That woman's got less than a minute to live." Joshua climbed the steps 2 at a time and handed over a bundle of records, inked with contracts, signatures, shipment logs, and Josie's written confession. Caleb was smuggling human cargo, and Etta saw. That's why someone poisoned him, not her. The papers passed hands. The crowd murmured. Doran's lips tightened. He read slowly, like the words hurt. "She still did it," a voice called from the crowd. "She's one of them." Joshua turned, voice like gunpowder. "One of who?" The man didn't answer. And Etta, still bound, still silent, watched it all with the expression of a wolf waiting for snowfall. She hadn't asked for Joshua's help, hadn't begged or wept or tried to claim innocence. But now, as Doran finally stepped forward and sliced the rope from her wrists, something flickered behind her eyes. Not relief, not gratitude. Something older, something calculating. They didn't let her go right away. The judge demanded further investigation. But the gallows were dismantled, and Etta was returned to a clean cell with warm food and an apology that came with no eye contact. Joshua visited her that night. "You were ready to die," he said. She looked at him. "I was ready to live through it." He didn't ask what that meant, didn't ask what she would have done if he hadn't come. But he left the jail that night with her eyes still etched in his mind, not soft, not broken, but sharpened like a blade left too long in flame. 2 days later, a man was found dead outside Dry Gulch. Another name from the ledger, throat cut, coins stuffed in his mouth. The sheriff said it was bandits. Joshua wasn't so sure. He looked east toward the river, where Etta had once told him the wind never stopped blowing, where the campfires of the old nations still flickered behind ridges, and silence meant more than prayer. She hadn't asked for his help, but now she had names. And she had time. The man in Dry Gulch was the first, but not the last. Within 3 weeks, 2 more names from Josie's list turned up dead. One was trampled beneath his own cattle outside Las Vinas. Another washed ashore along the White Fork, his boots filled with gravel and his hands missing. Each killing was clean, cold, and specific. No coin or jewelry taken, no panic, no prints, just silence. By the 4th death, they started calling it retribution. Not justice. Not even vengeance. Retribution. Joshua heard it first from a ranch hand up near Larkspur Hollow. The boy was drunk and talking too loud at a bonfire, whispering about the ghost girl with crow-black hair who marked her targets and waited for the wind to rise. "She doesn't shoot," the boy said. "She watches, follows, then she disappears. Next thing, the man she followed's got a knife in his throat or his horse gone lame halfway to the river and he don't show up again." Joshua didn't say a word, just turned back to his fire and drank deep from his flask for the first time in his life. He hadn't seen Etta since she walked free from Sparrow Falls under guard. The judge declared her not guilty, and the papers called it a miracle of law, but no one stopped her from leaving. She stepped into the dust of that afternoon without a bag or a home to return to. She didn't look back. The sun hit her face, and she squinted like it was the first true light she'd seen in years. Now she was myth. And Joshua knew better than anyone how myths were born, from wounds that festered until they hardened into stories. He kept following the trail, not to stop her, not to protect the men dying, but because something in him wouldn't settle, not until he understood the full measure of what she'd seen, what she'd lived. Josie's note had listed 11 names. 4 were dead. The 5th, Matthew Cleary, lived in the old river town of Carrow's Bluff, a place too stubborn to die and too crooked to thrive. Joshua arrived on a rain-soaked morning. The mud was knee-deep, and the streets smelled of fish and kerosene. Cleary owned a tannery near the wharf, a man who once bought native children for apprenticeships that turned into cages. Joshua found Cleary drunk, passed out on a cot behind a wall of stretched hides. A girl no older than 12 swept the floor nearby, eyes dull and lips scabbed. When Joshua asked where she came from, she didn't answer. He waited 2 hours for Cleary to wake. Then he beat him senseless. Didn't kill him, didn't need to. Left the man coughing blood into a basin and told him he'd best start confessing before someone else came knocking. Before the ghost girl stepped through the tannery door and made his sins final. "She's not real," Cleary wheezed, lip split. "Just a story to scare scum like me." Joshua only smiled. "Then you've got nothing to fear." He rode north, following rumors like breadcrumbs. A ranch burned outside Turner's Crossing. A brothel shuttered in Widow's Moor, its madam gone missing. In each place, people whispered of a quiet woman who left no name and no trail. Sometimes she posed as a cook, sometimes a laundress. Once, a mute traveler with medicine roots in her pouch and storm in her eyes. She never stayed long, just long enough for someone cruel to start getting nervous. Joshua stopped sending letters home, stopped shaving. He moved like a shadow now, like her, riding just behind the violence, studying it, trying to understand where it ended, if it ended. And then he saw her. Not in a dream, not in rumor, in flesh and dust. She stood at the edge of a canyon settlement called Tar Ridge, where the land fell away into red stone and fire. Her hair was tied back, her boots were cracked. She wore a miner's coat too big for her shoulders and held a bag in one hand, in the other a length of rope. Joshua watched from behind a juniper stump as she approached a man with a silver ring and a pistol at his hip, Thomas Slate, a man who once signed for 6 unregistered wagons on Caleb Redmarsh's property and claimed they carried molasses. She spoke to Slate. He smiled. They walked together toward the cliffside. When Slate didn't come back, the town assumed he'd fallen. Joshua waited until dark before stepping into her firelight. "You going to kill all of them?" he asked. Ada didn't flinch. "You said nothing when I came to your cell," he continued. "You let me think you were waiting to die, but you were counting names. You were already planning this." She looked up at him, quiet. "I should be afraid of you," Joshua said. "Then be," she answered. The flames cracked between them. "I don't want to stop you," he said. "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. The wind moved her hair, and in the flickering dark her face looked older than it had any right to, not in years, in memory. "You ever going to come back?" he asked finally. Etta shook her head. "Back where?" He had no answer to that, either. "You think killing them makes it right," he said. "No, I think it makes it balanced." She stood and looked at him full on now. They don't get to live easy, not while the ones they sold can't even sleep, not while girls carry what they did in their bones. Joshua felt it then, the weight of it, the depth. "How do you choose?" he asked. Etta's voice was low. "They chose first, I just answer." Then she walked past him, her boots crunching the dry ground. He didn't follow, not that night, not yet. But he knew her path wouldn't stop until the last name on the list was crossed. And when it was, he didn't know who she'd be. Or who he'd be for letting it happen. Spring came late and mean that year. Snow clung stubborn to the higher ridges, and the rivers swelled dark with thaw. By then the territory had begun to hum with rumors, not just of the killings, but of what they meant. Some said a band of avengers rode together, old blood from broken tribes reclaiming justice the courts denied. Others said it was only one woman, half feral and spirit-marked, walking westward with nothing but a rope and a name for fire. Most didn't believe she was real. But the powerful did, because they were the ones dying. 7 of 11. Joshua counted them like days. He rode between counties like a man caught between prayer and drought. He never carried a badge, but he kept the ledger strapped to his saddle horn, and he read from it like a Bible. Each death etched deeper into him, not guilt exactly. He hadn't done any of it, but a responsibility too heavy to set down. He'd lit the fuse when he cut her down from the gallows, and now he followed the smoke. He found number 8 before she did. Silas Mercer had moved south, buying land near the border, raising horses under a false name. He lived behind locked gates and hired men who asked no questions, the kind of man who'd spent years building safety out of other people's pain. He ran a quiet spread and paid his taxes, but in the ledgers, his past bled through in freight notes and coin transfers. He was one of the men Caleb dealt with directly. Joshua came as a buyer, clean-shaven, soft-spoken, with coin borrowed from a line of credit he never planned to repay. He got through the gate easy. Inside, Mercer offered coffee and half-lies. His smile was small and nervous, and his fingers twitched whenever Joshua mentioned livestock. They talked horses, then deals, then, carefully, history. But Joshua kept it light. He needed time. He needed to know when she would come. Because she would. He stayed the night in a bunkhouse, waited 2 days. On the 3rd, he saw her. Just a shape at first, black against the midday sun, slipping through the paddocks like smoke. No weapon drawn, no noise. She passed through the corral as though no one could see her, but Joshua did. He stepped out from the bunkhouse porch, boots on gravel. "You don't need to kill him." She turned, didn't speak. "He's scared. He's looking over his shoulder every second. He's already paying." Eda's voice came low, steady. That's not payment, that's delay. Joshua stepped forward. You want him to suffer. No, I want the suffering to mean something. She turned her head toward the house, toward Mercer's office, where the light burned always too late into the night. You know what he did. I do. Then let me finish. But Joshua didn't move aside, not yet. He has a daughter now, he said. 5 years old, I saw her, she calls him Papa. Eda's jaw twitched. She looks like you, he added. Something cold flickered through her gaze. Not surprise, not pain, something older like instinct curling in on itself. I've seen children carry their father's sins, she said. She hasn't had time to carry his, Joshua answered. That stopped her, briefly. The air between them thinned, stretched tight with unspoken things. She didn't ask how he knew about the girl, didn't ask if he thought she was capable of killing in front of her. She just looked past him toward the open door of the house. And then, for the first time since Tar Ridge, she stepped back. Joshua didn't know whether to thank her or apologize. She left without a word. That night Mercer locked every door in the house. Then he drank until he passed out. Joshua slipped the ledger beneath his bed and vanished before dawn. 8 remained 8. But not for long. Because number 9, a man named Riggins who once worked with the freight lines that disappeared girls through Salt Bend, turned up gutted outside a rail yard 2 weeks later. No witnesses, no suspects. Only a pile of charred ledgers left beside the body, as if someone had made a bonfire of his secrets. Joshua reached Salt Bend too late. He stared at the ash for a long time. Then he walked into the chapel and sat for the first time in weeks, not to pray, just to listen to the quiet. He remembered what Etta said, I want the suffering to mean something. But revenge didn't trade in meaning. It traded in precision. And she had grown precise. The 10th man was different, bigger, meaner. A ranch boss turned legislator named Judge Godfrey Trent. He wore a white hat and a red sash and shook hands with pastors while signing bills that vanished children into correctional labor. He'd been untouchable for over a decade, beloved in the papers and feared in the backrooms. He was also the last living man who could have ordered Etta's removal from her own people under Caleb Redmarsh's contract. Joshua found Etta in the high country before she reached Trent. She was sleeping in a dugout with her back to the wind, eyes open and unafraid. I know what you're here for, she said as he approached. Then you know I'm not here to stop you. She studied him. Then what? Joshua sat beside her, took out his flask, passed it over. She didn't drink, he did. I want to be there, he said. Her mouth twitched in something almost like a smile. That won't make you clean. I don't want to be clean. I just want to know who I am when it's done. The wind howled over the ridgeline. Far below, Judge Trent's estate glittered like a wound in moonlight. Etta leaned back, closed her eyes. You already know, she said. The next night, the estate burned. But Trent didn't die in it. They found him wandering blind through the brush at dawn, mouth sewn shut with horsehair, eyes red from smoke, ledger pages pinned to his coat like wings. He never spoke again. And that was worse. Joshua stood on the ridge the next morning, smoke curling around his boots, watching the sun rise behind Etta as she walked west without waiting for thanks. 10 names done. 1 remained. But it wasn't written in the ledger. It was written in silence. And both of them knew who it was. The last name was never inked. It wasn't in Josie's list, nor in Caleb's ledgers. It wasn't whispered in saloons or scrawled in rail manifests. But it existed, deep beneath the silences, behind the bruises Etta had worn for years like a second skin. A name that had shaped everything, and lingered even now like a bad tooth in the back of Joshua's mind. Josie Redmarsh. She had vanished clean, left Sparrow Falls before the noose came down, before the truth began to bleed out into the world. At the time, Joshua thought it was mercy, maybe even fear. But now, months later, with 10 names dead or broken, and Etta still moving west like a storm that refused to die, it was clear. Josie wasn't running. She was waiting. Joshua found her first. Tucked away in a quiet valley town near the water, far from the trails and far from memory, she wore a false name now. Mrs. Haldon, widow, seamstress, no longer the brittle woman who once lived behind Caleb's shadow. She had built something soft around herself, a garden, a pup that limped after her skirts, a community that didn't ask questions about where she came from. She didn't act surprised when she opened the door and found Joshua standing there. "You're early," she said. "I'm not the one coming for you," he answered. Josie stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled of lavender and bread. He hated it, not because it was warm, but because it wasn't supposed to be. People like Josie weren't supposed to find comfort, not when girls like Etta had to dig graves with their bare hands and sleep with knives under their ribs. "She's alive," Josie said, pouring tea. Joshua didn't sit. "You knew what Caleb did." "I did. You helped him hide it." She didn't flinch. "He beat me, starved me, used me like I was part of the furniture. You want to know what guilt feels like, Joshua? It feels like lying still in bed while he walks past your door to someone else's room." The cup in her hand trembled, but her voice didn't. "I tried to stop it, quietly. I left the names. I gave her the map. You also locked your door at night and left Etta to him." That hit a flicker in her eyes. "She was just a child," he said. Josie looked away. "So was I once." A long silence stretched. Outside, the wind had shifted. "She's coming, you know," he said. Josie nodded. "I know. She's not the same girl you last saw. I never thought she would be. She'll kill you." Another nod, slower this time. "She deserves to." Joshua leaned forward. "Then why wait here? Why not run again?" "Because sometimes punishment isn't about death. It's about being seen." They didn't speak after that. He left the house before dusk. And when Etta arrived, she did so like she always had, quiet as duskfall, boots slicked with road dust, face drawn and unreadable. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She just stepped into Josie's garden, where the woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting like a martyr who knew her time had finally come. "You could have stopped him," Etta said. Josie looked up. "I tried. Not hard enough." Josie nodded once. "No. You saved your son." "I did. But not me." Josie's eyes met hers. "Would you believe me if I said I wanted to?" Etta didn't answer. She stepped closer. Josie didn't cry, didn't beg. She just sat there while Etta pulled the knife from her belt, the same blade she had taken from Caleb's old tool, shed the day she first bled in his house. The tip of it traced a line up Josie's arm. Then stopped. And didn't cut. "Why?" Josie whispered. Etta's voice cracked for the first time in months. "Because you'll live longer than they ever did." She turned and walked away. No fire, no rope, no final blow. Just a silence so heavy Josie collapsed beneath it. Etta didn't look back. She passed Joshua on the trail, eyes forward, jaw tight. "It's done," he said. She didn't answer. He followed her to the ridge above the valley. The wind tore at them there, the same wind that had followed them both since Sparrow Falls. It smelled of pine and something older. "You could stop now," Joshua said. "No one would blame you." She looked west, where the land broke open into horizon. "I'm not done," she said. "You got all the names. I wasn't talking about them." He studied her. "What then?" She turned to face him. "I'm going to find the ones who paid for it, the ones behind the ones, the men with clean hands who wrote contracts in backrooms and never touched a girl but owned her just the same." Joshua's breath left him. "You think that trail ever ends?" "No," she said, "but I'll walk it anyway." They stood in silence, wind howling like a chorus of all the ghosts they'd stirred loose. Then she reached into her satchel and pressed something into his hand. A page from Caleb's ledger. Blank. No names, just space. "Why give me this?" he asked. "So you remember there's always more." He looked down. When he looked back up, she was already walking away. Boots cutting through scrub. Head high. No fear. And behind her, the wind carried no mercy. Only purpose.